Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another Omnibus review, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a second volume in an Omnibus series that I started looking at a while back now, I think in summer last year, when I took a look at the Captain America Omnibus Volume 1, the classic Silver Age era of Cap by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Today I'm going to be looking at the second volume, which I've got here, a book that I've had for quite a while now, a few years in fact, but have yet to get around to looking at it on this channel, so that's going to change today. There is also a third volume over there, which I will aim to follow up this review with and cover that book as well at some point. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. I can always try to make sure I look at that sooner rather than later, if so. But here and now, let's take a look at this second volume as Cap moves from the late 60s into the early 70s. We see the continuation of Stan Lee's writing, but the introduction of pencilers like Gene Colan and John Romita replacing Jack Kirby. So stick around and we'll see what's going on in this era of Cap. Here we are then with the Captain America Omnibus Volume 2, and I mentioned in the introduction there that this is the kind of continuation of the Silver Age era of Cap and running into the early Bronze Age era as it gets to about 1972 by the time we see the last of the material collected in this book. So this book came out in 2016, the first and I think only printing of this book so far. But as with most Marvel omnibuses, I would imagine that, that this is something that will get another printing at some stage sooner or later. So if it is a book that you don't have and would like to add to your collection, I wouldn't lose hope. I'm sure it will be available again at some point. This was the standard variant cover, by the way. It's by Carlos Pacheco and Dean White. We did, of course, lose Pacheco in the last couple of months or so. He did pass away. It's been a pretty rough year, the last 12 months, I think, for losing quite a few kind of comic book legends. Some great artists and creators have passed away. Not great, but of course we still get to enjoy their work, which is a real treat. Looking at the back of the book, we get that classic kind of cover gallery showing the issues collected herein. And what that is the Captain America series, issues 114 to 148. So a good run of issues here, quite a big chunk of material. And we're going to take a look inside and see exactly what that looks like, really. So, as always, I give a spoiler review here. This book is one that I'm going to showcase in a fair amount of detail, as I tend to do on the channel. The actual design of this book, this version of it anyway, pretty plain. This is before they were using kind of different logo designs and stuff on the back, as they do now with the kind of Silver Age era, Bronze Age era books when they print them. But yeah, so I'm going to show it off, talk about a few plot points. As always, I won't aim to cover absolutely everything because there's a large chunk of material in here and it would take a long time to try and discuss it all. But we'll take a look at the credits here. So as I mentioned in that intro, we do see quite a lot of it in here still being written by Stan Lee until the last few issues when Gary Friedrich comes on to replace him as the writer. As for the penciling, it is primarily by Gene Colan, which is all good with me as I'm a pretty big fan of Colan's work. I think he's just one of the all-time greats in comic book art. Also a few issues contributed by John Romita, another great artist of whom I'm a fan, and then a few other pencilers you can see who filled in for an issue or two here and there, along with obviously the inkers and letterers. You then get your contents page, which showcases everything we've got here with the publication dates of the original issues. So yeah, going from June 69 to April 72. And then you get a few of these kind of introductions that have been written in the past for different collections which previously collected this material. And then we jump right in. So I remember speaking about Volume 1, albeit some time ago now, and mentioning that that material in that volume was probably some of the weaker material from Marvel's Silver Age during the 60s, when they had obviously a lot of great characters and series coming out. The solo Cap series for a while was not really one of the best. I mean, he was sharing a comic with Iron Man in Tales of Suspense for a while. But even so, those stories, you know, not fantastic, not some of the absolute best. Enjoyable, certainly if you're a Captain America fan, it's worth going back and checking out some of those early stories. But overall, I didn't think it was the strongest material. I do think that over the course of the material collected in here, in this second volume, things do start to get a lot more interesting. And that's primarily because of a few factors. I think that the artwork in here, primarily by Colan and then also Romita, is just a step up in kind of dynamic quality. As much as Jack Kirby is obviously a legend and in many ways the absolute greatest artist and one of the most creatively talented minds in comic book history, his artwork to me is not always the most exciting when you go back and look at some of that kind of 60s material. I do think that Colan in particular in here does a great job of kind of adding an extra layer of dynamism to the art and just giving things that more of kind of an exciting flow in some of the action sequences, and trying out different styles to just experiment a little bit. But it's not all perfect in here. This is by no means one of the absolute best runs of books that I've ever read. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, for one thing, the Red Skull, who was used very heavily throughout the issues in Volume 1, I think there was an over-reliance on him during that era. And that kind of continues in here. You know, this book pretty much opens up with this multi-issue story arc with the Red Skull using this cosmic cube to swap bodies with Steve Rogers. And that goes on for quite a while. It's quite a wacky story, in line with the storytelling style of the time, that's for sure. But yeah, Red Skull was a character who, as you read through some of this classic stuff, especially if you read through a lot of it in one go, if you're to read through, you know, for example, these omnibuses in a pretty short span of time, if you're anything like me, you will get a little bit sick of seeing him, because he turns up so often that I feel he loses a bit of his impact, really. As much as he is a good villain, you know, if you overuse a good villain, they do start to lose some of the impact that they otherwise would have if they're used more sparingly. But what I will say as well, as I think about these different points as I go through the book and remind myself of what's going on in here, I do think that one of the things that does lead to the stuff in here being an improvement over Volume 1 is the larger cast of characters that starts to be established, as well as giving them all a little bit more kind of screen time, so to speak, a bit more time on the page, a bit more of a prominent role in the story to actually give them more of a personality. So characters like Sharon Carter, who is Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. and primary love interest for Cap during this time. She gets more of a time to shine. She plays more of an active role in actually kind of going on missions and getting involved in fights and doing things for herself. So it's quite cool to see that. Before too long in here, of course, we do get another key character debut with the first appearance of the Falcon, which is right here actually, issue 117. Sam Wilson, the Falcon, first appeared in here. And yeah, it's quite an interesting introduction for him. He's kind of on this this sort of island looking after this kind of tribal village. He's kind of found himself in the role of being a kind of guardian to them. I think it's quite interesting that perhaps easily forgotten these days, but in the beginning, the Falcon actually did have a pet falcon, a real actual falcon called Redwing, who he used as a kind of partner. He was partnered up with this actual falcon. Here we see him getting his original costume for the first time, and you know, not bad as first costumes go. Not great either, but yeah, it's pretty good. And I think that bringing in the Falcon into this story, because soon enough in the issues collected in here, the title does actually change from Captain America to Captain America and the Falcon, as they become a regular partnership. I think it does help the book because it gives Cap someone to kind of bounce off, and I don't know if this is something people will agree with me or not, but certainly at least in this classic era, I find that Cap is more interesting when he has other characters to be, you know, to work with, when he's written as having other characters to star in a story alongside. So I think Cap, for example, is more interesting in the Avengers, tends to be anyway, from this era, than in the individual solo stories. Because Cap's a little bit of a, I don't know, his personality is not necessarily the most exciting, you know, not always anyway. I mean, sometimes it is, obviously, but for the most part, he's just kind of that kind of embodiment of truth, justice, and the American way. You know, he's the ultimate kind of good guy. You know, there's no kind of moral ambiguity with him. He always does the right thing. You know, a true hero kind of character, which is all well and good, but I think it's more interesting when he therefore has other characters, you know, in the story to add other elements and other kind of personalities to it. I don't know, let me know if you agree or disagree with that, but yeah, so what we're definitely seeing at this point, this is all the Gene Colan artwork, by the way, which I'm a big fan of. As I mentioned, it's just very cool. I think that Colan's style lent itself very well to this book and creates some pretty cool moments, and you get you know, villains like this creepy looking dude who Colan is able to really kind of just bring out those kind of weird characteristics in how he draws certain characters. also use scenes like this, very much reminiscent of what he was doing in Tomb of Dracula in a way, which is probably my favourite Gene Colan work, with these kinds of styles of shading and transitioning, very kind of unique stuff that is just very cool. There's an issue here with the Scorpion, classic Spidey villain, getting involved in a tussle with Cap. And you get this villain here, she's pretty cool, Suprema, kind of head of an evil organisation. Which is often what happens in these books, you know, quite often with Cap, because he's working with S.H.I.E.L.D., like quite often directly working with them, with Nick Fury and the gang. More often than not, Cap's fights tend to be against kind of evil organisations, you know, rather than individual villains. Sometimes, obviously, it is just a fight between him and someone like the Scorpion or whoever it might be. But quite often he's taking on these big kind of evil, as I say, evil organisations like Hydra and stuff like that. Get an appearance in here by MODOK. And there are some weird villains as well. So, you know, there's still some kind of wacky villains, you know, again, in line with the storytelling style of this time. You know, we're talking about the 60s, the 70s, eras of comics where there was still definitely a lot of wacky plot points and stories going on. But you know, that's something that I generally enjoy. You know, overall, I'm a fan of this era of comics, with Marvel in particular. So yeah, I'm all for a bit of weird wackiness and fun. You know, now and then. Characters like you know, Diamond Head being a good example, who we see here. But yeah, by now, Sam Wilson kind of coming into the story. We see him again here. By the end of this book, his costume changes again, as well, from this green costume to I think probably the better remembered white and red costume, probably more associated with being his classic costume from this kind of era. But some of the stories that start to be explored here are quite interesting as well. Maybe a little bit on the nose, not too subtle maybe, but with Falcon being introduced as a black character, you start to get a bit of an exploration of kind of racial tensions going on, and it kind of comes to a head at times where there'll be these scenes, these moments where Sam will say to Cap that, you know, he can't understand some of the things he's going through. You know, Cap, you know, Steve Rogers, obviously a white guy, different background, different upbringing, different experiences in life, etc. So some of that stuff is kind of explored, and it is interesting. I think overall it's well written. You know, for the time anyway, you know, it's not explored in total detail, but these kinds of ideas are explored in an overall good way. You know, for example, I think, unless I'm misremembering the story, there's these storylines where, you know, people are criticising Sam Wilson for forgetting where he came from and all that. Yeah, as I say, an interesting kind of thing. It's quite good to see them at this point in time, an era of comics where, I suppose you could say, more realistic and serious issues were being explored within stories like this, you know, when previously stuff like that had not really been touched in comics. And over the course of the 70s and then obviously into the 80s and beyond, that started to be more and more the case. So it's interesting to see a bit of an early stage of that occurring in here. Overall, I definitely had a good time reading this book when I did go through it. I think it was sometime last year when I last read through this. It did feel like it's a step up in storytelling from that first volume. I felt like the pace was just a bit faster here. There were points when I was reading volume 1 where, honestly, some of the stories in there, you know, sorry to say, just a little bit boring at times. Like, you kind of just want to get through it and get to the next one. That didn't really happen so much in here. I was getting a lot more invested in the story. As you say, I think a key reason for that, as I mentioned already, was just the introduction of more characters and therefore more plots involving those characters that added a greater variety, I think, to the stories in here than there was in volume 1, which did get quite repetitive at times because it was just a lot of time just Cap pretty much on his own, beating up people, and then that'd be the end of that story and you get onto the next one and it all happens again. This is a pretty cool story though. This is one where you get a classic kind of thing, kind of sci-fi thing with a kind of a mad scientist turns himself into this gorilla kind of creature. Totally bizarre, but pretty cool. And you see here, like, all these other characters getting involved. You get Nick Fury, Sharon Carter, Sam Wilson coming in. And really nice artwork here by Gene Colan. I think inked by either Tom Palmer or Bill Everett at this point. Very good, complements the pencils very well. And then we get into this next issue, which I believe is the Spidey issue, yeah. So, another good one. Yeah, I don't know, I just had a good time reading this. I don't know, let me know your thoughts if you checked out this era of Captain America before. You know, as always is the case when I cover books like this, I'm always happy and eager to hear the thoughts of others. I will still say, you know, when it comes to this era of Marvel, you know, this isn't up there with my absolute favourites, which I feel like I always say when I'm doing reviews like this, is always going to be, you know, Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. I'd probably put those ahead of this in terms of books and series that I enjoy from this time. But this was definitely not bad in any way. This is a good run of issues, and I think this is where, you know, during this sort of time, this is where the Captain America solo series really started to find its feet after a fairly rough start. And I think if you are a Captain America fan, there's definitely fun to be had with this overall, as you see the character becoming a bit more complex and the storylines becoming more interesting. I think we're into the point now where, yeah, these are the kind of last few issues in the book where John Romita's doing the penciling. And you can pretty much always tell that John Romita just has one of those very distinctive styles, especially when it comes to how he draws faces, I always think. You know, that is a John Romita face, you know. In particular, the way he drew women is just a very unique way. You can pretty much always tell. But yeah, so all in all, a very interesting book and a good piece of Cap history, of course. But if we take a look through, we start to see, yeah, I think these are some of those scenes that I talked about earlier with Sam. Some of the dialogue is a little bit questionable, I will say, in scenes like that. It's not necessarily being written in the most, let's say, realistic way. But like I say, I think it was all well-intentioned, and it was good to see them having a try at tackling some more serious social issues. As I say, during a time where that was not necessarily the norm in comics. But pretty cool. And I think when Gary Friedrich took over, you know, he did a good job as well, replacing Stan Lee as writer. Pretty cool stuff. Yeah, so let's have a look at the extras in the back anyway. Oh, actually, before I do that, I'll just showcase, because by this point in time, I think this is where Falcon has his new costume. See if I can find a page that shows that off. Probably not, now I mention it. Anyway, it's the white and red costume. I'm sure you know it. You've probably seen it. Even though it seems to not be on any of these pages, but there you go. Kingpin though. Pretty cool fight. Cap and the Kingpin. Oh, there he is. There's Falcon's white and red costume, which he replaces that green costume with. And I think it's a better look for the character. Yeah, I prefer that costume. Not that it really matters much, but yeah. Anyway, so yes, if we move into the extras in the back, it's a lot of the usual kind of stuff, kind of different posters, house ads, some pencil sketches, in this case by John Romita, then some stuff here by Gene Colan and Joe Sinnott. All interesting stuff, you know, not a huge extra section, but pretty much what you'd expect from a book like this, really. Just a few nice extras there in the back. There's that standard variant cover. But yeah, so there we go. That's Captain America Omnibus Volume 2. Hopefully something that was quite interesting to look through, especially if you're not maybe too familiar with this material. Hopefully, you know, that was in some way insightful and maybe helped you to make up your mind one way or another as to whether this is something you want to check out at some point. But as always, thank you for sticking with me through this book. If you watched the video all the way through, that's appreciated as always. I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.